attendance. This is the fourth Clyde Cameron Memorial Lecture. The first three we held in Canberra, and of course Clyde Cameron was the Minister for Labor in the Whitlam Labor government from 1972 to 1975, and Clyde Cameron was also a close associate of the Henry George movement in Australia and was on the public record as an advocate for the economic philosophy and teaching of Henry George. Our first lecture was Professor Frank Stillwell, and then we had from the University of Sydney, and then we had John Bannon, former Premier of South Australia and also a good friend of Clyde Cameron and a former advisor to Clyde Cameron, and then last lecture we had Jack Waterford, who was the editor-at-large of the Canberra Times and also a known supporter of the ideas of Henry George. And this year we've got Professor Bill Mitchell from the Centre of Full Employment and Equity with the University of Newcastle. And Bill has been a long-time advocate for social justice and a fairer economic system. And his topic tonight is myths about government spending and taxation.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks, Ron, and the Association for inviting me. I'm a bit of a strange fit, given the previous speakers, because I'm not a supporter of Henry George. And I had my differences with Clyde Cameron. So let's start with that. And we'll see why and how we can salvage that difference in some way. But thanks for all the organisation, really great. So these are what I see as being the contemporary challenges that the world economy faces. And I won't go through each one and articulate them. We've had a very long period of stagnant economic growth, and some countries like Italy are still locked in recession after 7 years. That's led to very high and entrenched unemployment and underemployment. And when we hear politicians say we're close to full employment in Australia, you should always respond that the sum of unemployment and underemployment is now above 15%, probably closer to 16% when we get the new underemployment estimates. And if you add the fact that we've had a much reduced labour force participation since November 2010 because of the slower growth, then that broader wastage of labour gets up close to 18 or 19%. We've got high youth unemployment and rising not employed, not in education or not in training, the so-called NEET generation. And if you look at the unemployment, underemployment and dropping out of the labour force of our teenagers, that the current coffee estimates are around 45%. They're 15 to 9-year-olds, they're our future. So at the end of next month, I think they're going to release it, or maybe this month, they're overdue legally. When they release the so-called intergenerational report, they'll rave on relentlessly about affordability and the ability to fund future public services and therefore the need for surpluses. But of course the real crisis is that our future workforce is progressively being denied jobs and work experience. That's the real problem. We've got a tax on trade unions, welfare systems, bridges are starting to crack, trains are getting ripped up all around the place, and we've got sluggish, if not stagnant, real wages growth, zero. And that's led to this problem of rising poverty, income inequalities rising all around Australia, all around the world, including Australia. And even the IMF is coming clean these days and saying that rising inequality undermines the capacity of an economy to grow. And of course this is leading increasingly in some parts of the world to increased social instability and the rise of political extremism. I mean, Syriza in Greece is an extreme political reaction. The same will happen in Spain and of course in Other countries, you're getting extreme political reactions on the other side of the political spectrum, in France and Belgium and elsewhere. And that's what happens when you have this dysfunction in economic and social dysfunction. And I have to say that we've got a massive challenge that we have a government that's in denial about with respect to the sustainability of our social and economic settlement on the land and the physical environment that we live in. So they're the challenges. And my hypothesis is that government policy exacerbates those problems, doesn't help us solve them. And what explains that seems like a curious thing, that we are now continually electing governments that undermine our prosperity and damage our social and economic structure. Well, what explains that is that I've got a book coming out in May about the Eurozone, and it's entitled Eurozone Dystopia, Groupthink and Grand Denial on a Grand Scale. And it's this concept of groupthink that I've been researching quite a lot over the last few years. And it's a pattern of group behaviour that reinforces itself and denies any alternative thinking coming in. And what I argue is that this neoliberal groupthink has set governments on a course that deliberately undermines our prosperity, yet we continue to support them. And that's a very curious policy thing to observe and research and understand. And I think if Clyde Cameron was still alive, he would be incredibly concerned with the state of play in policy-making circles. Now, Clyde Cameron also, as Ron mentioned, was a really strong advocate of the single tax theory of Henry George. And what I'm proposing to do is to bring this mindless groupthink, Clyde Cameron's interest in policy, but also his expression of that interest in the single tax ideas, try to bring them together. Now, groupthink comes from social psychology research. Irving Janis was the first one really to coin the phrase, and there's a sort of summary. It's a sort of mob rule that maintains group discipline. And if you're an economist, I'm a rare breed of economist, because most of economists are in the mainstream, free market-oriented, neoliberal economists. And they are a vehement lot if you have a different opinion. And I've given talks where the discussant to my keynote speech has got up and said, we've been visited by a visitor from Mars today, as a put down to discredit the views that I have. And that's groupthink operating. That's the way in which promotions occur in academic structures, the way in which articles are published, research grants are offered. There's this pattern of group behaviour that reinforces itself and eschews any variation. And it happens in all disciplines of thinking. For years we knew how to combat the scientists had discovered the source of stomach ulcers as being a virus that could be treated by a simple antibiotic. And of course the pharmaceutical profession and the medical profession didn't want that out because it would undermine their lucrative thing. That's groupthink, suppressing information, suppressing alternatives. Clyde Cameron, I think, if you don't know, was a shearer, left school early. First big formative experience was unemployment during the Great Depression, and that generation who were unemployed, including my father and many others of his ilk, were deeply scarred by the Great Depression, and it influenced the way they thought for the rest of their lives. He became a trade union organiser, but he was in the Australian Workers' Union, which was anti-communist. and also because they'd been so scarred in the big industrial upheavals in the 1890s, had forsaken direct action. They weren't a militant union, they were pro-arbitration. And Clyde Cameron's approach as Minister for Labor really reflected that. He entered, he became a functionary in the ALP, he entered Parliament in 1949. He was in the left faction of the ALP, and he was continually expressing hatred for conservatives, the captains of industry, you know, the shonks, those characters. And but over time, he increasingly aligned himself with the middle-class careerists in the ALP. And these were the lawyers who hadn't really come through the trade union movement as tradespeople or workers, unskilled workers. They'd gone to university. The new breed of the baby boomers, or early baby boomer breed. He became a sort of ally with Whitlam and helped Whitlam once he got Whitlam onto the federal executive, and once he got Whitlam onto the federal executive, they purged the left of the Victorian ALP branch, which was a very significant event in ALP history, and basically put the ALP onto its current course, which is basically mindless conservatism. 1972 he became Minister for Labor, and his first action was to motivate the very large public service wage rises. And to his credit, he also introduced Mary Gaudron into the arbitration process and pioneered equal pay for women. Now, it's been a failed strategy, but to his credit, he did that. But then, of course, the wheels fell off the world economy in 1974, and in all of the chaos that have followed the oil price rises, when the OPEC cartel pushed up oil prices and promoted the inflation around the world, the ALP swung to the right, as did many other so-called social democratic governments, and took on the pro-business mantle that they've currently got. And to his discredit, I think, Clyde Cameron went along with that. And as Minister for Labor, because unemployment was starting to rise for the first time in late 74 and then became a significant problem in 75. And I think to Clyde Cameron's eternal discredit, he was the person who introduced the nomenclature dole plunger. He was the first person to call the unemployed dole plungers, and him and Bill Hayden used terminology like work-shy lion tamers to vilify the unemployed, who were unemployed because the government was cutting back spending and the private businesses were going on their so-called capital strike, if you recall, to undermine the viability of the Whitlam government. And the other thing, of course, is he promoted the single tax. And I think to understand, you have to understand history. A lot of people will come to these type of lectures and talk about all the good things that Clyde did, and he did a lot of good things, and he was genuinely interested in worker equity and pay equity and gender equity and those things. But like his confreres in the ALP, he pioneered what I now call the neoliberal groupthink, because it was in that final year of the Whitlam government, and certainly when they purged Jim Cairns from Treasurer role and Hayden took over, and Cameron fell out with Whitlam, and they put in, what was his name, as Minister for Labor. Anyone remember that? Mook name. Anyway, the person they put in was a known trade union basher, and that budgetary process of the 1975-76, the last Labor budget, was all about the damage that fiscal deficits were causing. And if I read out some of the quotes from the cabinet submissions by Bill Hayden at the time, I could trick you into believing Joe Hockey was saying. It was that bad. The swing to the right was that bad. And that was the point, the juncture in which neoliberalism which the Australian government bought into the so-called Milton Friedman monetarism, which we now think of popularly as neoliberalism. That was the juncture. It wasn't the Fraser government that introduced it, it was the Whitlam government that introduced it. And the...
McClellan?
McClellan, James McClellan. Yeah, thank you.
Diamond Jim.
Yeah, Diamond Jim. He was deliberately put in to, even though Clyde Cameron was starting to bash the unions in '74 and demanding that claiming that the wage rises were excessive, etc. McClellan was the one who really hit him hard when he became minister for a very short period, of course. And so the combination of the vilification of the unemployed by Clyde Cameron and Hayden and other senior ministers in the Whitlam government, and the acceptance that they had to have a monetarist inflation-first fight strategy, and Cairns in his last briefing to the cabinet warned them that if they tried to cut social spending, which Hayden had proposed to cut, welfare spending, support for the unemployed, support for public schools, public hospitals, etc. If they did that, they'd have a rise in unemployment. They sacked Cairns as Treasurer, installed Hayden, and of course that's what happened. And unemployment rose in 1975 and never has come back down. And I also think that Clyde Cameron was wrong in accepting Henry George's view that the unemployment that they were seeing, and I would say causing, was a problem of the tax system. And so that's what I want to explain, if I can. I also, this is a brief reflection, I've always thought that Clyde Cameron's embrace of Henry George was curious, because Clyde Cameron started off on the left and of course Henry George was on the right. Henry George was anti-socialist. He refused to deal with the socialists, who were his principal allies because they were the ones pushing for land reform at the time in the 1870s and 1880s, before he died. And he refused to deal with them because he didn't like them, didn't like the concept. He was pro-business. And, Clyde Cameron hated business, at least early on, before '74. And Henry George was a free marketeer libertarian, hated regulation, whereas Clyde Cameron was a champion of regulation. So it was I always thought that was quite curious. The common ground, I think, is that both thought that the land tax would take the tax burden off wages, increase real wages, and of course Clyde Cameron was a champion of the working person, not the unemployed, but the working person. So briefly on Henry George, for those who don't know, he wrote this famous book, Progress and Poverty. It wasn't an original piece of work, he was derivative of the classical economists David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, but even before that, the French physiocrats had developed these ideas. And the basic idea is that land is in fixed supply, and in other words, if you own land, as population growth occurs, the value of land will go up and you'll be able to extract income from that ownership without doing anything. John Stuart Mill talked about the landowners becoming wealthy in their sleep. And so the argument was that was unfair relative to the workers who had to work hard for their income. And of course, Henry George said the capitalists had to work hard for their income. Of course, Marx would disagree that the capitalists did anything other than own the capital. The other element of Henry George's thinking was that the because there was such unearned income in owning land, that led to speculation. Everyone wanted to get hold of land, and those speculative manias would cause boom and bust cycles. And he wrote his book during the period in which was called the Panic. And this was when the big railroad collapses occurred, because in that time the railroad companies went crazy building parallel rail lines out into the west of the US. He was an American. And of course, so much fixed capital investment couldn't be supported by the traffic and the prices they could charge passengers, and they went bust. And there was massive speculative losses made. And so that's it in a nutshell. That the idea is that you shift the taxing burden from wages and profits and push them onto this unearned income and tax it away. And the notion of an economic rent is that it's a payment that a resource gets, which isn't required to supply it. So an example is a rock star who would happily go and play for much lesser fee because they like playing and it's fun, yet because of their extreme popularity, their demand is very large for their services relative to their supply. They can extract a huge payment well in excess of what's necessary to get them to go out and rock. And the same sort of principle applies to land. Now, underlying Henry George's paradigm was two things, therefore, that currency issuing governments need to raise taxes to spend, and that the tax arrangements with respect to land, at the absence of land taxes, cause recessions. And what I'm going to tell you briefly now is that both propositions are wrong and shouldn't be supported by any progressive movement at all. But that doesn't mean that the concept of a land value tax doesn't have merit. But we've got to separate the merit from these other spurious propositions. Now, Clyde Cameron, because he was a proponent of Georgism, believed both of these spurious propositions. Now, a big event happened in 1971, August 1971. President Nixon closed the so-called gold window. And what that meant is that he no longer would guarantee convertibility of the US dollar back into gold under the so-called Bretton Woods Agreement, which had been the post-war currency arrangement in the international sphere. And the gold convertibility of the US dollar supported the so-called fixed exchange rate system, where all countries agreed to peg their currencies against each other relative to the price of the US dollar, which was then set in a fixed price against an ounce of gold. And for various reasons I won't go into now, Nixon abandoned that system in August 1971. And what that meant was that exchange rates became flexible, and all currencies ceased to be convertible currencies and became what we now call fiat currencies. Now, I could give a whole lecture on that, but the import of that event in 1971 is that governments like Australia, who issue a fiat currency, which is not backed by anything, have no financing constraints at all. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, the characteristic of a fiat currency is that its face value is worthless. It has no value. So previously it was backed by gold, it had value, and commodity currencies in the previous historical epochs, like silver currencies or gold currencies, they were valuable. And for those old enough to remember the introduction of decimal currency in Australia, if you remember, the 50-cent coins disappeared very quickly. And why was that? Was because they were made out of silver and the face value of the silver melted down to 63 cents, not 50 cents, and so they soon fixed that up. But that was an anomaly. Now, why would we accept a currency that's worthless? Well, the reason we accept it is that governments impose a tax liability on us that has to be relinquished in that currency. So one of the roles of taxation, the government is the issuer of the currency, but it has to get us to accept it. And the way it accepts it is to force us to have to get it to satisfy our legal obligations. And the only way we can get their currency is if they spend it into existence first, because they issue it. And so in a logical sense, the taxation can't be funding the government spending, because we need the government to spend it before we can get hold of it. Now that'll be counterintuitive to you, I know that, but that's the reality. Currency issuing government is nothing like us as households. We use the government's currency and we have a financial constraint. We have to borrow, earn, sell, or run down savings in order to spend. A currency issuing government like Australia can spend without worrying at all about where it gets money from, because it issues its own money. And the Australian government can never run out of money. It can never be short of Australian dollars. You know, to say that the Australian government can run out of money is like saying that the AFL has to close down a footy game at the MCG at half time because the scoreboard's run out of points to put up scores. It's equivalent nonsense to that. Now, the governments around the world, imbued by this neoliberal hatred of government activity and wanting to create as much space for free markets as possible, force governments to impose voluntary constraints on themselves. So they have this elaborate machinery and accounting structures where it looks like the tax revenue's coming into an account and they spend out of that account. It looks like the debt that they issue goes into a special account and then they spend. It looks like it. It's a chimera to disguise the reality that government spending is free of any funding constraints. Just to give you an idea, this is the neoliberal period. This is the national unemployment rate in Australia from 1861. This period was very special because this was a period where the governments assumed that their fiscal policy would be used to create enough employment. And they ran almost permanent deficits through that long period. So why have we had this sharp rise in unemployment? This was the Hayden's budget, and unemployment's never gone back down to that level again. And we've had, economists to wield out all the time saying, oh well, the structure of the economy's changed, and this is now full employment, whereas that used to be full employment. It's all lies. It's all part of the reinforcing groupthink to con the ignorant, the uneducated populace into accepting their political will. Okay, mass unemployment. It's got nothing to do with land, taxes, or the absence thereof. The capitalist system produces output if they can sell it. And to sell output, they need to get people to spend. And when I spend, I create income for somebody else. So if I buy something off Bernie, you get an income. And you respond by producing things. And the basic macroeconomic rule is that total spending must equal total income for all the goods and services to be produced in any period to be sold. That's just a basic economics 101 rule. It's due to deficient spending in the economy. Now, why would spending be deficient? Well, because we save and we buy imports. And so let's just take saving. If we start saving each week, well then we're not spending all of our income recycling it back into the system. So what's going to happen? Well, the income's reflected in output that's been produced. If we don't recycle that back in, then the output level's going to fall because firms don't produce unless they can sell. And so the only way you can have a system where the non-government sector, that's households and firms and the external sector, if they're saving overall and desiring to, the only way you can maintain steady output and avoid unemployment is if the government sector fills that spending gap that we've created by saving. And this leads you to understand that governments always choose the unemployment rate. Don't ever believe them when they say, oh, the unemployment rate's because of real wages or because of idleness or any of these other nonsense you hear. The government can always choose the unemployment rate by modifying or adjusting its spending to ensure there's enough spending in the economy to create enough sales in the economy so that firms will hire enough workers that are available and produce things. And as I said in the introduction, the Labor Party were the first ones to introduce this vilification of the unemployed, to cover up the fact that they were deliberately causing unemployment in late 1974 and 75. They started to attack the victims of their policy failure and calling them dole bludgers, and and Fraser and subsequent governments just refined all of that. And now it's the norm. It's part of the public narrative that the unemployed are unemployed because they're lazy, they can't be bothered looking. Well, that's not true at all. Unemployment is because there's not enough spending. And if there's not enough non-government spending, the way you can solve that is to create enough government spending. Full stop. And Clyde Cameron and his confreres in the Labor Party obfuscated that reality. Whether they understood it, I don't know. Some of them did, I know, but whether he did, I don't know. But they obfuscated. And they created the paradigm we now live in. Now, the other point, of course, is that the government taxes the non-government sector and it reduces its spending capacity. And that adds to the leakage from the spending system. So we know that governments overall, if the non-government sector wants to save and also the government's taxing the non-government sector, then the government has to run a fiscal deficit to fill that spending gap. And of course, Henry George didn't understand that at all. And the followers, chapter and verse of Henry George, keep repeating those errors. And they don't need to, but they do. A single tax will not eliminate recession risk. All right, now this is the hard bit. Taxes do not fund government spending. If taxes don't fund government spending, well then what does it do? And this is an important question because this helps us understand the role that a land tax could play. And the question's tied into another question, as is, what are the real, and you see that's in bold, what are the real limits of government spending? And I've already said the government should maintain total spending such that firms are willing to produce output that will be sufficient to employ everybody at current productivity levels. And so how does taxation fit into that aim? Well, here's the big paradigm leap. The role of taxation has got nothing to do with funding government spending because we've already established that governments issue the currency and don't need to fund its own spending. So why do they tax? Well, they tax to create a demand for the currency, but they adjust tax rates and tax levels to create real resource space. And what the hell does that mean? Well, that means that if households, firms or government spend money, go and buy things in shops and order in factories, etc., then that system can be sustainable without inflation occurring if the firms and the people, the sales, the shops, etc., can respond to that spending with selling real output things, tables, chairs, cars, houses, bits, clothing, whatever you're going to buy, real things. If the total spending in the economy outstrips the capacity of the shops and firms, etc., to meet that spending with real output, then the only way the economy can adjust is by putting up prices, to ration off that spending and bring it back in line with the capacity of the economy to deliver output. So when I say real resource space, they're real resources that the government's going to be buying with its spending program. And if the government's out there competing with the non-government buyers for real resources, then it runs the danger of pushing the economy into an inflationary situation. So taxation takes purchasing power off us, which we would have otherwise used to buy goods and services from firms and shops, takes it off us, and therefore creates idle resources, if you think about it, creates unemployment in a way. And so, but that gives the government the space of real resources that it can then buy things and run its political and social and economic mandate. It gives the government command over resources, real resources. That's the role of taxation, to free resources up so the government can take them off us in a way. It's a coercive process. Because if the government didn't do that, it doesn't need to tax to spend, but it needs real resources to be available that the non-government sector is not buying. Now that's hard to get your head around, but that's the reality. So the taxation doesn't provide the government with any financial capacity. It provides it with real resource space to take command of real resources in the economy and use them for public purposes rather than private purposes. And if it wants to expand its real footprint in the economy, then it has to raise taxes. If it wants to have a smaller public footprint, it can reduce taxes. The other important strand is, well, what's the purpose of government? And a famous economist in the 1940s, Abba Lerner, wrote that he developed this concept called functional finance. And he said that we've got to always appraise and evaluate government policy in terms of advancing social purpose, and any tools that they use to advance social purpose have to be functionally related to that purpose. So if you want government to do something, and the best way for the government to accomplish that through spending, and it needs to take some money out of the private sector in order to create that space, and it might be a tax is the best way to do that. There might be other ways to do that, like selling a bond. But you would appraise each option according to the function that it was supporting, not as any standalone concept. And the problem in today's narrative and discourse is that we've become obsessed with the fiscal policy parameters, the tax and the spending parameters, completely divorced from the context. So the narrative is all about the deficit ratio, how big the deficit is. Well, what's it matter how big the deficit is as a standalone, divorced from the context, the function in which the fiscal deficit is pursuing? So I could see a deficit of 2% of GDP would be totally disastrous, yet a deficit of 10% of GDP would be totally appropriate, depending upon the conditions of the economy, depending how strong our saving preferences were, depending how much income's being leaked out in imports. So the actual there's no figure that's appropriate. We shouldn't be obsessed with the figure. We should be obsessed with what it's doing. And if we've got 6.4% unemployment, 6.5% unemployment and lots of underemployment now, well then the deficit is too small. And it needs to rise because it means that non-government spending, private sector spending and what we get from the export sector isn't sufficient to employ enough people. So there's only one other solution to that. The government has to employ more. That means government spending net of its taxation revenue has to be higher. It's no secret. It's not even rocket science. And this obsession that neoliberals have with fiscal rules, and you know, have a look at what's happening in the Eurozone. They're so obsessed with their stability and growth pact that they hack into government spending when the private sector was withdrawing its own spending. And they just made the situation worse and more prolonged than it should have ever been. The financial ratios, how much debt the government's got, what size its deficit, are irrelevant when divorced from the context. Okay, I'm now in the final state. The role of land value taxation. Well, think about what I've said the role of taxation is in a modern monetary economy. It's to withdraw spending power from the private sector to create the real resource space so that the public sector can spend. That's the role of taxation. The question then is, does land tax help achieve that objective, or can it pursue certain objectives that are beneficial to public purpose? And one of the big problems around the world are housing bubbles. Now, you know, Henry George would like to tell you that housing bubbles are all single causes. They're speculative manias driven by credit and debt. Well, that might explain, say, Ireland recently or Spain recently, but it certainly doesn't explain the housing bubbles in central London, which are almost exclusively cash purchases from Russian oligarchs and Middle Eastern sheiks and Chinese capitalists. It's got nothing to do with credit and excessive credit and the banking system, nothing at all to do with it. So you've got to understand how, you've got to investigate the source of the problem with housing bubbles. That's the first point. But it's probable that expanded credit availability with low interest rates do fuel housing bubbles. And so a land value tax on unearned income, the speculative component of the income that land ownership drives, may well be a useful thing. And it will probably reduce the inequity that arises from the ability of landowners to, in areas of high demand like central London or our capital cities, to generate this unearned income when the rest of us are thrashing out every day earning income and being taxed. So it will probably improve equity. And clearly I think that was Clyde Cameron's motivation. Even within the paradigm that I operate in called modern monetary theory, or now called MMT, which is, I've articulated some of the basic principles of, a land value tax could have a place. But you'd need to evaluate that place relative to the function that we're serving and how much revenue it could achieve to give the required fiscal space. And if you examine the research literature out there, the Georgists are pretty short on giving very detailed analysis of what the levels of tax should be and what revenue they would deliver. That would need to be done. So what I've tried to talk about tonight is giving you an alternative view to the mainstream narrative that's out there that will become repugnant over the next 6 or 7 weeks as the fiscal cycle accelerates. And the idea of fiscal sustainability has got nothing to do with the size of the deficit or how much government debt. The government can be, I haven't talked about debt tonight because of the time, but it's another story. But the government can service any liabilities that it incurs in its own currency. The Australian government borrows only in Australian dollars. It issues the dollars, so it can always repay its debt. It can buy whatever is available in Australian dollars whenever it likes. And as I've indicated to you, the limits on what it should be buying and how much it should be buying in Australian dollars depends upon how much spending gap there is left from our savings and our imports. When you say that the government has no financial constraints, that's not the same thing as saying it should spend crazy. There's a limit on how much government spending should be, and that's the real resources that are required to be brought back into productive use, that the saving of the private sector overall is left idle. And so when we talk about fiscal sustainability, we want governments to run good deficits rather than bad deficits. A bad deficit is one that has risen because unemployment's risen and tax revenue's fallen and the government's done nothing about it. A good deficit is the one where the government spends sufficient amount to fill that spending gap and creates full employment. In other words, it's pursuing a function. The deficit is functionally related to objectives that we care about, that is full employment. Fiscal rules themselves are meaningless because the government can't even control its fiscal balance. So when, the Eurozone governments have been cutting like hell, trying to reduce their deficits, yet when the data comes out next, you see the deficits have risen. Why? Because their austerity undermines growth in the economy, destroys employment and destroys their tax revenue. It's a mindless pursuit. The deficits will go down when the private sector's spending a lot and there's got high employment, and they'll go up when there's high unemployment. That's the reality. In closing, Clyde Cameron was really committed to worker education, and he of course had his name attached to the trade union training college in Albury. And he was of that generation of men, because it was a male-dominated world in those days. He was of that generation of men who really believed in worker improvement through education and knowledge and understanding. And I think, given what's happened over many years, and certainly what's happened since his death, I think he probably would have agreed with what I've said tonight. And I think he would have seen some of the things that happened in the Whitlam years, and I think he would have seen his willingness to vilify the unemployed as mistakes and as reinforcing things that he had said he hated. And that is this triumph of financial capital, this triumph of the rich and the wealthy, the so-called 1%. I think he would have seen that some of the things that the latter day Whitlam government did fostered this neoliberal infestation of decency. And let's hope he would have been able to see that. That's it.